that whatever problems people have in the United States with perceived bias against Israel, and I think there are certainly news organizations that are unfair to Israel. It's much less bad in America than pretty much anywhere else. I think, BBC, for example, I would say this, and it's a very not pleasant thing for me to say, to a certain extent is almost endemically hostile to Israel. I mean, it's critical even for, on days when there should be nothing to be critical about. I think journalism on the whole is failing Israel and itself when it covers our region to a large extent. I think they underestimate the nature of Islamic extremism, and therefore they underestimate what they're up against. I think there's a failure to understand context. For example, when Israel fought Hamas in Gaza 6 months ago, you can say lots of things to Israel's detriment. You can say that it used too much force. I would argue with lots of this. But if you don't give people any sense of context, they're not going to understand anything, and they didn't. And context means, for example, that Hamas came to power in Gaza violently by killing its own people, that Hamas deliberately cited its weapons capability in civilian areas, that it constructed a civilian theatre of war where its rockets were housed in mosques and where its weaponry was stored in the ground floor of apartment buildings, where it was firing and booby-trapping schools and so on. If you don't explain that the enemy has drawn fire into its own civilian areas and deliberately put its people in harm's way, then when they look at the harm that is then caused, they don't understand why. Right? When you feel very strongly, and I do on the basis of what I've seen and what I know, that Israel has actually tried to minimize Palestinian casualties and they've been trying to maximize ours. If you don't explain that in journalism, then you're failing your audience. If you don't explain, for example, when Israel was fighting against Hezbollah in southern Lebanon, that in Israel the press is free and therefore they are able to show everything that's going on, aggression and casualties on the Israeli side, whereas in South Lebanon the press is not free and therefore Hezbollah didn't allow the world media to document its aggression. If you don't explain that, then people get a skewed sense of what's going on. It looks like only one side is actually using force. And those kinds of failures, I think, contribute to creating misconceptions. I think they're pretty acute in parts of the media. Like I say, I think American media on the whole is relatively much better than European media. And I think that's one of the reasons, that the sense that we are portrayed unfairly that led to the establishment of the program that you're on now. And therefore it's very important that you see firsthand, that you get a sense firsthand. In Gaza, for example, I have a friend who works for the BBC, and she was actually trailed by an Israeli television news channel one day, and she said, among the many ridiculous things that she said, the numbers speak for themselves in Gaza. There's 1,000 dead Palestinians and there's only 13 dead Israelis. As though if only hundreds of Israelis had been killed, then it would have been all right. Yeah? But hundreds of Israelis weren't killed because we protect our people. Because we have sirens and we have bomb shelters and we keep them out of harm's way, whereas the Palestinian leadership was deliberately putting its people into harm's way. And I think that, so I think there are some pretty dire failings in that. And I think if you understand the narrative more effectively, and I don't use the word propaganda, because propaganda implies an abuse and a skewing of facts, and I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about honestly explaining what is happening here. I think if our reality is explained honestly, then I feel Israel, then the narrative that emerges is the narrative that is pretty close to the way Israelis see things, and I don't think that gets out all the time. It's important if you feel strongly that that's an accurate narrative that you help spread it.